Well, everyone, welcome to the Way of Champions. We are very excited because in almost 300 episodes, Jerry, we've had a lot of people here, world famous coaches and psychologists and researchers and top athletes. But today we've got Ryan Bernacchi, who is definitely our first ever Top Gun instructor and first ever head of the boss of the Blue Angels. Um, and F-18 pilot, so much more, and then our connection to you, Ryan, through the U.S. Naval Academy, where you were the director of leadership and character development, and worked directly with our mutual friend Cindy Timschel with the women's lacrosse team there. And she said, you have to have Ryan on. So that was a no-brainer for us. And we've had just great back and forth before the podcast even started via email. And so Jerry and I have been looking forward to this for many, many weeks. So welcome to the Way of Champions.
Oh, thank you, John and Jerry. As have I. I certainly am excited about this, and so grateful and humbled by your intro, as well as the friendship with Coach Timschel has been really impactful in our lives, my family, and for me. And so it's just really neat when it brings people together.
Yeah, well, certainly we're having you on at a time where the Top Gun is back into the popular vernacular with another movie just crushing the box office and everything like that. And so we're going to talk about that experience and the Blue Angels experience. But Jerry, why don't you kick it off here? Because I know you wanted to sort of start with this connection with Cindy.
Yeah, Ryan, first of all, I want to start by saying how grateful I am for your service for this country and uh, how much that's appreciated. Uh, I first met you when you couldn't even see me, which was when you were on the field standing next to those lacrosse athletes. And every time out, you would walk out into the circle. And I looked at that person and I saw, yeah, he's a captain. I know he has 4 rings on his sleeve, having been in the Navy myself, but never at that level. And Cindy was so gracious to me. She said, "Do you think you could have Ryan on?" And I said, how could I not? How could we not consider a man of that experience? And having said that, honestly, I always thought, he walks out there in the circle. I'm wondering what was that like for you? And what did you feel and experience from a cultural standpoint and from the energy that was going on? You seem to really be having a lot of fun doing that.
Boy, the that circle was the first time it happened. It was like, hey, someone just said, "Hey, come on, sir, come on," and so I went, "Oh, okay." I felt a little bit like out of place, or even a little bit of an imposter, because I thought that's their circle, right? I haven't earned a place in this discussion on the field, and then that quickly went away. But I will say the part that never left was the awe, right? So here, didn't matter if we were winning or losing, at a timeout or before halftime, wherever. When one of these things when the coach would call for the team, and sometimes they would occur on the sidelines too. The captains would call or something. It was always a really special energy, and often little was said. In fact, I almost never said anything. There was maybe one exception to that where I thought I might be able to add some energy, but the energy was so high, the intensity was so palpable, and the determination on each one of those women's faces. Is they're so laser focused on what do we need to do next, what's going wrong and how do we fix it, or what do we need to do to win, to hold this lead, or whatever it is. The intensity and the energy in it was just like nothing I've ever felt. And that includes, the environments I've been in. Maybe we'll touch on that every once in a while. We get that same level, but there was something very special about being on a field with that caliber of team and those caliber of athletes.
For our coaches listening, you experienced Cindy Timschel live and in person. And we're both smiling and sort of like chuckling a little bit, but she brings something that's really important and you experienced that. What did you sense about her in that circle? What was it that was special that maybe some coaches listening right now could say, you know what, God, I can be that way?
Yeah, I think, and it was such a rare environment to be in, but I don't think it's unique to that team. I think you could have that experience anywhere if everybody's bought into that degree. And so, I never quite knew what Cindy was going to say. She always would start and with great intensity of what two or three things maybe she wanted to see different, or sometimes it was just one thing, right? This is what you need to do. And she would have a lot of confidence in that. And I was always impressed by how she had a view of how things would unfold that she could express, but she would do it very succinctly. And then at the end, there was always a moment of levity and love, right? It was one or the other, or usually both combined, where she would say something lighthearted about getting out there and playing for the love of each other. Um, or she'd try to say something, to get them fired up, and it might come out wrong, and she'd just start laughing, and everybody would laugh, and then off we would go. And so I thought those were beautiful. She was very direct in the beginning about what she wanted to see or what she thought the team needed to hear, and then it was something light about competing, about the love of the game, about what you're playing for, and usually would end in just a big smile and it's often laughing, and it was
Mm,
great. It was beautiful, and you never knew, but it kind of broke the tension too,
yeah.
you know, and it gave you that big picture perspective. And so I always cherished it. You never knew exactly what she was going to say, but it was always just it put a big smile on your face, and then it would boost the energy. We'd break the huddle, and they'd get back after it, and that was always inspiring to see.
Well, she was being the coach in the first part of the timeout, and the second part of the timeout, she was being Cindy.
Right.
And to me, right, the important message here for all of us is we got to be ourselves. And when you're yourself, people respond. Look how you responded to that. Look how the kids responded to that.
Right.
And and that was the beauty of a Cindy Timshaw. And I want coaches to understand that the more you're yourself, you get into a huddle, just be who you are. Yeah, do the X's and O's, but make sure you pick up on what Ryan's saying, which is, it just brought humor and love and connection and it took away the stress and the tension. They went out there and they were having fun together. Anyway, thanks for making that point. That's precious.
Well said. Yeah, no, that's exactly what she would do, and I think it would offer some perspective sometimes too, because you can get so wrapped up.
Mm,
Um, and so, it was really, really special to be a part of that. I cherish that time on the field, both on the sidelines, and I mean, every bit of that experience was
mm.
was incredible. The time on the bus, the time meeting with players one on one, or the captains. We lived at the Naval Academy at the time, so the team was in our house all the time. It was just really one of the great gifts, one of the very best experiences of my life.
Ryan, I mean, let's talk about your experience in as the coach of teams, right? In Cindy's role, except your teams certainly were the best of the best pilots in the world, the best people at what they do. And obviously the consequences of losing a lacrosse game are not quite the same as the consequences of, you know, high performance flying with the Blue Angels, or, a commander in the Pacific Fleet. Um, what How did you manage your teams? Do you see some of the things that Cindy did in your teams? Was your leadership style different? Given what you were doing, I mean, just talk about that and shed some light on what it is like to be in charge of the Super Hornet squadron, or in charge of the Blue Angels.
Yeah, the stakes certainly are different, and the anyone who's been in that role, and I think you both could relate to this with your grown up, sons of firefighters, that there are some very high stakes, and very sadly sometimes we experience, the worst of all of that, and I certainly have, and carry that with me, and those some of those scars I don't think ever heal. But I think beyond that, I think the corollary is really really close. I think the experience, the teamwork aspects of it, the approach to learning and to the mistakes that are vital to that learning process, to learning how to do something very challenging, are really really similar. And so and that was something I really saw come into focus when at the back end of my career, I suddenly was in this very high performance sports environment, and just kept, every time I turned around, I went, wow, it's the same. And the pressure too, I think, the pressure you can feel as an athlete. I have a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I see it in them too. And I certainly saw it in the Navy teams, as well as in my own experience. The pressure feels the same, that you don't think about the stakes being different, but the pressure to perform is high in either context, right? In flying or on the field, whatever your sport is. And so I don't think the pressure. I think you get much better at handling the pressure with experience, with reps, with techniques, with the support of your team. But I think that learning process is the same, and I think it's fairly interchangeable. And maybe a good example that pops to mind is, in flying, it's about decision making and based on the information that you're receiving and processing. And when you first start flying, you're not receiving or processing a whole lot of what's going on around you, but you're also not moving very fast, and you've got someone there helping you, right? And so, the first trainers we flew in the Navy at the time went about 180 miles an hour, turboprop, a little light plane. And so about 3 miles a minute was about how fast you had to think. And that was hard at first, but by the time you were finishing that phase of training, you felt like you were moving pretty well through the sky. And then you step up into the jet trainers, and now you're moving at 300 or 400 miles an hour. So maybe 5-6 miles a minute, and then you get your wings, and you go out to the fleet and start learning how to fly. And in my case, a fighter, an F-18, and now maybe you're moving at 600, 700, 800 miles an hour. And you start putting other things that are coming at you, like other airplanes going that speed also. So you could go from tens of miles per minute to 20 something miles a minute in terms of closure, but it's a very gradual process over years. And I saw the exact same thing when I was standing on the sideline, especially at first, and I could not believe the power and the speed of these athletes as they transition the ball down the field, and how fast they were reacting to what was going on around them, and what they could see with their vision. As it would look like a blur to me, but it didn't to them. And then flip that back to my daughter, who was 9, 10 at the time, and the speed of her lacrosse game versus the premier women playing at that level. And I went, this is exactly the same journey that you go through learning how to fly a high performance airplane. I imagine it's the same for anything that requires that sort of decision making and performance under pressure and with a time component.
Well, you know what's great, and sorry, Jerry, I just have to say, because I spend so much time teaching youth coaches and talking to parents about this, right? The 12-year-old lacrosse game is not supposed to look like the college game, right? They don't have enough reps. They're not big enough, strong enough, fast enough. Yet so many parents want it to look that way or want it to move fast. And there's nothing easier than to be standing 100 yards away from the play thinking, well, how did you not see the open player or whatever? And it's a very easy game until you get closer and closer and closer. And then once you're, like I always tell kids, if you think you can play at that level, stand on the sideline. Don't stand up in the top of the stadium. It's a lot different game. I want to ask you just a really interesting point here of this idea of feeling pressure versus competence. And knowing that you are competent and prepared, you still have pressure. That is, that's what you signed up for, right? Stress, anxiety, whatever. But knowing that you're ready for it is so important, and that you've built up to that, constantly being stretched and challenged to the next. I mean, I was just talking to an athlete who was super nervous about taking a preseason fitness test. And my thing was, well, are you ready? Well, no, not really. Well, then that's why you're nervous. Like, instead of preparing yourself, and then going, yeah, I'm ready. Why would I be nervous if I was ready? So just talk about that, competence and pressure and how those things go together.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I think you hit it exactly on the head. And so, gosh, we could talk about carrier landings, we could talk about Top Gun sorties, we could certainly,
Talk about your best stories, man. That's why
yeah,
you're here.
yeah, certainly the Blue Angel experience was is probably the most direct corollary to a big game, because you have this big crowd watching as well. And I do think that I've been asked that question in a different, never in that way though, about how do you connect the how do you handle the pressure, or how, are you nervous, or however the question is phrased. And the answer, I first learned as before I went to Top Gun, on my second deployment, we was during the shock and awe campaign in Iraq, which was in 2003. And I remember we had a build up to it, and I felt like I was really at that level. I was really squared away and very competent in what I was doing. I felt ready. And so before the first night of the war, I spent a little bit of time in my stateroom. I wrote a couple of letters and kind of filed those away. I told my roommate where they were in case something happened to me. Um, and then a great deal of peace came over me, and it was just time to go to work. And that's what we did. And I learned so much about that because I had been so focused on the preparation. I had been working so hard, not just with me, but with my fellow teammates to get everything we could ready for both the offensive and defensive side of what we were getting ready to go do, or what we thought was going to happen. And I found that the confidence that came from that gave me great peace. And there are no shortcuts to that, right? There's only one way to do it, and that's to go out and make the mistakes and do the reps and learn from your mistakes until you build that next level, right? It kind of goes in stages, and then you strive for the next plateau. And it was the same thing. I left that environment, and that's when I went to Top Gun as a student, and then stayed on. And it was the exact same thing there. What seemed impossible in the early weeks of the course were things we weren't even thinking about. 9, 10 weeks later, as we're handling these very complex scenarios. And that process has just repeated throughout my life. I think the Blues were a great example of that. And along the way, what I picked up on was what one of my wingmen termed but it's not an original term, was just clearing the mechanism, in terms of how to get ready now to go, right? You've done all the work, you've debriefed it, you've learned from your mistakes, you've gone out and gotten better at it over and over and over. Now it's time to go to work. Just like it was that first night over Iraq, just like it was in front of that first air show, or, the 150th air show, but now it's in Chicago, or it's at Miramar, and there's, 400,000 people. It looks like a NASCAR race, as you climb into your jet, and you're like, wow, well, you still got to go do the thing, right? And so you close the canopy, and for me, that's where I found the mechanism. For me, I needed a ritual to help just process that I'm ready, and to flip my mind forward into doing the work. And so for me, that was always this lowering the canopy. I think athletes do it in different ways, and it probably depends on your sport and kind of how you take the field or leave the locker room or the night before. But for me, in the F-18, there's a switch that you control with your right hand, with kind of your middle two fingers, and it just mechanically lowers the canopy, makes this whirring noise, and then it closes, and then all the outside noise goes away. So it's both metaphorical, but also has this physical silencing effect. And then you get into the motion of starting the engines, and pretty soon your hands are just moving, and you're not really paying any attention to what they're doing, but the airplane's coming alive, and your mind is now doing this thing that it's really good at. So that would maybe be perhaps my advice, is to seek something similar in whatever the context is, where you can count on that to always help you calm down and be confident in what you've learned. So that confidence piece, I do think, directly ties to competence. It directly ties to knowing that you've made all the mistakes. And maybe that's another great place. This was something that was told to me when I was a young pilot, and that I used when I was a commanding officer of a squadron, was for my young pilots, I wasn't going to send them out on their own without a flight lead in charge of the, a section, which is 2 airplanes. I would actually send them out by themselves right away, but not responsible for employing a mission with a wingman until I thought they had made all the mistakes. And once I was confident they'd made all the mistakes, then I knew they would make a gazillion more, but they'd made all the big ones. So go do your thing. And I would sign off that qualification without any caveats or restrictions. It was day, night, any weather, any situation. You have my full confidence and trust to go do everything, not because you're really good. You might be that, but because you've made all the mistakes I think you need to make to be trusted in that environment.
Love that, Jerry. I mean, I know you wanted to get into that idea of how a great culture is a culture that's makes mistakes okay, right? And I love what you said, Ryan, about that you signed off once you made all the mistakes, and now I know you can make them and be okay with it. Now I sign off on you being competent in doing this. Jerry, what you had you and I were talking off camera about this idea. Any thoughts to jump in here with?
What a question. Any thoughts? I'm mesmerized by this. The thing, Ryan, that you said that really spoke to me, well, I went to flight school. I didn't quite take it as far as you did in the Navy during Vietnam. And I remember that canopy coming over my head. And what I remember most, which is really interesting, is the silence. And here I am 40, 50, I don't know how many years later. The silence was really key. It was a touchstone. It was like, okay, I'm in my world. That's that world. I'm ready to go. It was almost like we're ready. And how do you create that? Well, 45, 50 years later, we're dealing with the inner game. And such a big component of that is the silence as a metaphor. The silence outside and all the chatter with the parents, with the coaches and everything else. And listening to that inner voice, because it's now quiet and we can hear that inner voice. And that inner voice speaks to us and says, you're ready. Let's go. Watch me. And so, mistakes are part of life. And as John said, it's part of a culture. The culture says that we will make mistakes. And the culture also says we're better because of it. On a Monday morning after the women at Navy lose a lacrosse game, the first question Cindy wants to ask is, why are we a better team because of that loss?
Love it.
And the second question is, what do we need to do to get better? And how do we improve upon this? Not what went wrong, but what needs work. And then you get down to work. So that image of you in the cockpit, boy, I could feel that palpably from experience, not at your level. And I want to make sure people understand that. But it's that metaphor of silence that we all need to think about in terms of that. It's the inner game. It's that place inside where high performance has a chance to let itself out.
I love it. I couldn't agree more, Jerry. And I don't think you need a canopy closing physically over your head to achieve that. Another big tool we used was visualization, which we could probably have a long discussion on. But that was also a thing that gave me great confidence was, every week we'd be somewhere else. So it'd be a different air show, 30 something different sites a year, different terrain, different obstacles, different weather. Sometimes, the weather forecast it could have been, who knows what we were going to get that day. So maybe I'd have to have 3 or 4 different variations of the air show ready to go based on what the forecast was. And so preparing for that was a big part of my job each week. Countless hours of studying would go into each show site. But when I would close my eyes and fly the show, I would sit in my room, my hotel room. My neighbors, the random person next to me must have thought there's some crazy guy sitting next door. But I would sit in my chair and I would make all the calls. I would make all the radio calls, and they would happen in real time. And I would fly the whole game, so to speak, in my mind. And often I would fly branches and sequels. Well, what if this happens? Then this is what I'll handle. If we have to switch from a high show to a low show, this is how we'll do it. This is the part where we'll make the transition happen.
Mhm.
Um, hey, there's a real tricky mountaintop over on the right side of the show. Let me fly around that in my mind. And all of that I would find in the same way that we talked about that confidence coming from practice and reps on the field would also, in an additive way, increase my overall confidence. And I think it's because in my mind, I was, my brain didn't know that I was sitting in a chair. Once I would get my eyes closed and really start flowing through that, it would be, maybe semi-meditative, but that visualization is so, so powerful. And for us, it was we didn't have a simulator to do all this work, ahead of each show, or even to learn the maneuvers. You can't really simulate those things. And so that was really powerful for my confidence.
Yeah, and so let's bring the analogy back to the playing field, because they don't have a canopy. As you say, you can do it without a canopy. The U.S. Navy women and all the teams that we work with, John and I, the canopy is that quiet, sacred space where everything in the world is blocked out. And Cindy's team, as you know, the day before would sit in the locker room in the circle as a sign of unity and connection and caring and love. And what they would do is they would feel the world that they were going to enter through visualization. They would feel the world, just like I would imagine you're feeling yourself in that plane. You're feeling the speed. You're feeling this and that. And so it's important that we all understand your experience is so relevant to everything we're doing, not only on the field, but in all of life, because I wake up every day and I'm feeling my day. I felt this show going on before I even sat here. I sat in that chair right over there, and I felt John's energy. I felt your energy, and so, yeah, it's so amazing that you were doing that. And at that level, why, we need to do that at all our levels of life.
I couldn't agree more, Jerry. And to your point about levels, this wasn't something that is unique to the Blue Angels. I mean, flight school students are doing this. That's where I first learned it. I got really good at it with the Blue Angel context. But before, I had hundreds of carrier landings. I think I had 300 and something of them were at night. And during the day before each one of those night landings, I would find 5 quiet minutes somewhere on the ship, usually in my stateroom, when my roommate wasn't in there or whatever, and I would just sit and quietly fly that pass. And then I would fly it high, I'd fly it low, I'd fly it, with a lined up left or right correction. I would fly it with weather, I'd fly it with the deck moving a little bit, if there's some feeling the ship move. And for all the same benefits, I think number one, and this shouldn't be lost, is it's a rep, right? I'm only going to get so many night landings. That's a finite number based on how many deployments I do and whatever, but I can fly a lot more of those in my mind in between each interval. And maybe you do 1 or 2 or 3 a week, but in between each interval, I can get a rep. And the parts of my brain that activate to fly that landing activate exactly the same sitting in my stateroom as they do closing in on the ship at night. And I think the same is true for most aspects of athletics. Now, some of the muscle memory is you can only build one way, but once it's built, you can still get those reps on it afterwards.
Right.
And so I think that's an important point, is it's hard to visualize something you haven't done or haven't done well yet. But once you understand what it takes, you can get additional reps to add to your ability there. So I think the fact that it's a rep is really important. But the other thing is, now fast forward maybe 8 hours and I'm at the tail end of a flight and I'm tired and it's really dark out and I'm trying to line up behind the ship. And when I would get to that point where I'm pushing over onto the approach, I'd already been there in my mind earlier that day.
Yeah.
Multiple, it would be very calming. Yeah.
And and we know this is science. This is backed by science, what you're saying. And the science says the central nervous system, as we know it, does not distinguish between what's real and what's imagined.
Yep.
So all your imagination was real. You've been there 100 times before.
Right. Exactly.
And so what's really neat is that people say, oh, that's sort of Wow, yeah, you can talk about that. That's up in intergalactic bliss someplace. And I'm saying, no, no, right down here on Earth. Let's remember our zip code. You know, we know where we are. And where we are is we're in a position physiologically and emotionally and mentally to have our nervous system interpret things as if we already have done it. And then therefore that innate intelligence allows us to expand upon so many things that we're worried about and we're fearful about. And as you say so well, it gives you that confidence. I've been here before. I've done this. John, do you?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, let's just put it in the simple term is that when you play the game is not the first time you've played the game. You've already played it in your head. You've already landed on the
On the
aircraft
field.
carrier at night. You've already run through your show for the next day. And what's amazing is, right, the US military has invested tens of billions of dollars studying the importance of these things and teaching it. So like you said, you do this the first thing in flight school, right, when you start. um and yet I would say it's only a tiny percentage of sports is looking to get this advantage. Not just, like, you want to do it individually, but also collectively see our team performing together. And it's hard because I think there's something in sport where people have said, oh, that's silly, or that doesn't mean anything. But yet here you are leading one of the highest performing teams in the entire world, and you're going through all the basics in your head, right? Here's Kobe Bryant showing up at 4 a.m. every day and doing the most basic footwork and the most basic shooting, just being fantastic at the fundamentals. And this is the part that these parents we mentioned before, they want their kid to skip. They just
Right.
want to be great, and they don't want to do all the little things that it takes to be great, like play the game in your head before the game is played. So maybe that's just me on a rant, but feel free to.
I love your rants, John.
I've been nodding my head, vigorously with both of your responses to that, and I could not agree more. I think that it's one of those things that there are no shortcuts, but there are ways to get additional reps. There are ways to build more time in, and I think the hardest part when it comes to, we call this chair flying, but really it's just visualization, right?
Mhm.
I do agree. It's the power of your imagination that is doing the same thing. And really, flying is a lot of that spatial part of flying is in the same part of your brain. But sports are so spatial too, right?
Mhm.
So I think that there's a lot of science that would support this, but the importance of doing it is conceptually easy to understand. What's hard to do is just to get in a habit of it.
Mhm.
I found that was hard in flight school. I found you feel kind of silly at first, especially if you're doing it out loud, which is, at least with the flying, I think it's really important to say the radio calls as they will come, and to be moving your hands and your feet as if you were flying the airplane. And so it slows you down to 1.0 on the speed, right? You can't visualize at 1.5. You can't do the little fast forward button, like, I'm going to zip through this. So you have to carve out, if a carrier approach is a 12-minute approach and you want to fly the whole thing, it's going to take you 12 minutes sitting in your
Mhm.
room. If you want to
Mhm.
fly a 42-minute high Blue Angel show with, in clear air, you can skip the taxi and the stuff, maybe, and this is counter to it, you can skip a little bit of the basic footwork that's that basic of just getting out to the runway. And yet some places that's tricky too. So you have to think about that. So, but then once you release the brakes, and turn the smoke on and take off, you cannot fast forward through that flight. You got to budget that time, I guess. And then you just feel a little awkward at first, and you don't really think it's going to pay off until you do this a bunch. And then it's really, really powerful. And it's especially powerful looking back. And I think, carrier landing is another great analogy, because each one of them is graded. You can see how you did, but there are also other pilots standing on the ship very carefully monitoring the approach, and they'll tell you how you did in no uncertain terms. And those times when you skipped the chair flying, or you were too busy and you just suddenly find yourself behind the ship that night, and it doesn't go that well, and you get done, you're like,
Mhm.
wow, I should have taken 5 minutes. That
Mhm.
would have been the difference. And so you learn some of that the hard way. But I think the hardest part, especially for young people, I'm working on this with my daughter right now, is getting in the habit, doing this, and maybe a little bit before you go to bed. I found for me, I slept way better the night before a big flight, if I spent a few minutes reviewing, even if it was just the sticky parts, right? The
Mhm.
most challenging parts, maybe I'll spend more time visualizing this later, but just so that I can put this out of my mind and just relax and go to sleep, I'm just going to review this a couple times. That would give me the confidence to then set it aside and
Mhm.
go to sleep, and which is also vitally important, of course, right? So all of those things came together for me,
Mhm.
and it really was about the confidence, which is where this conversation started, that came from the reps, including those mental reps.
Mhm. Jerry?
John and Ryan, I'd like to sort of switch gears. There's so much. I mean, I could see this being a 3-hour conversation, and I would love it, love it. Uh, so anyway, maybe we'll have to reschedule another one. There's a misconception out there, and correct me if I'm wrong, that to be a Blue Angels commander, to be a Top Gun instructor, to do all that, those flights, those carrier landings, it's like landing on a postage stamp. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? In the water from elevation. It's amazing that that's done. But the misconception is that you've got to be, by general definition, the guy who we're talking to, you got to be tougher than the way you're talking, you know? From you got to be, I don't know, it's almost like some kind of rough edge to you. Uh, but I don't see that. From the moment you and I connected, that first phone call, I think I told you this, but if I don't, I'll tell you now. You were one of the most humble, one of the most vulnerable, open, receptive people. And it just didn't seem to match what most people would think of when they would talk to someone with your caliber. I want to speak a little bit about that in terms of leadership. I mean, here you are the premier leader of these groups, and yet you come across to me, and it sounds, today it sounds extremely part of who you are, a humble, vulnerable human being who's handling all of this amazing stress and tension, anxiety, and leading groups of people in warplanes, the F-18 and what have you. Let's talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I, uh, it, I, I really appreciate you saying that, Jerry. I kind of don't have a response. I do think that,
Your lack of response is part of your humbleness,
yeah,
and let's
um,
connect, make the connection here.
I mean, I could tackle sort of the, the stereotype. I think, and it certainly got blown out of proportion again with the Top Gun movie coming out, which I thought was phenomenal from an entertainment standpoint, but not how, and the cinematography was beautiful. We could have a whole conversation about how all that was done, but the just the stereotypical characters, they're all playing pool and sizing each other up, and
Tom Hanks.
yeah, yeah. It was just kind of
Tom
like,
Cruise, Tom Cruise,
I'm
not
sorry,
Tom
Tom
Hanks.
Cruise.
Yeah.
it's just
Sorry,
not how
thanks.
it is, right? And in fact, I think for the most part, those sort of personalities, the ones that are strutting around like a peacock, don't tend to make it very far in that business or any other, because it gets in the way of the really important stuff, right? It certainly gets in the way of learning. It definitely is a barrier to good leadership. Nobody wants to work for someone like that or follow someone that's all about themselves. And so I think they're really, I think, you know, I've, this is not trying to be over modest. I still sometimes scratch my head how I ended up in any of the amazing squadrons and opportunities that I've had, other than I just kept working hard and applying and asking, and I didn't expect to be told yes on a lot of things, and I wasn't told yes on a lot of things that I asked to do, and that's okay also. Um, but over time, I think, if you really are humble, it speaks to, if that's part of your character, it really speaks to an ability both to learn and a primary focus on others. And I think if you're about the team, if you're about accomplishing the mission, you don't need to go around chumping, strutting around or thumping your chest or being, a super macho tough guy. I think it speaks for itself in a quiet way if you're willing to, in my case, if you climb into that airplane and go shooting off the front of the carrier and go execute the mission, right? You don't have to make a big deal about it. And I can get excited. I'm excitable. I get fired up. I certainly would. Especially when I was younger, I look back on it and get very fired up. But I think trying to be humble and bring an element of calm is really important. And so that's what I try to emulate. And I can tell you, I've not been perfect at it by any stretch. I've learned the hard way on everything I know, and I'm still striving to get better at all of these things. I mean, no way would tell you that I've arrived at as a leader. And when I look back on the times I've been in prominent leadership roles, boy, I'd love some do-overs because I got a lot right, but I got a lot wrong too. And so I think that's just a continuous learning process.
Well, it's interesting because of that mystique that comes from Hollywood, of these guys that you just completely debunked. Like, you still have to have a level of self-confidence to fly at that level to be good. But we had a guy on the podcast here, Steve Magnus, and he says in his book about true toughness and resilience, he says, true confidence is quiet and insecurity is loud.
Yeah.
And I really like that, right? It's like the louder you are, it's this false bravado, because deep down inside you're really not prepared, you're scared, you're whatever, and so you put out this front, whereas true confidence is, I got this, I'm good.
So true. And, in an ironic sense, because we're in a podcast here, I tend to talk more when I'm less confident.
Mhm.
Um, and I can be much more succinct when I've got a clear view. And so, I could point to times where I was on, one end or the other of that spectrum, but it's certainly what I try to seek and improve myself on. And I don't think, to your question, I don't think those are required ingredients other than, yes, you do need to be confident, and try to walk that line between being confident and cocky. And I think I've stepped over that line at times as well. And I've never been happy with how that felt or went. And I try to get back into the right side of things. And so, it's a journey, and some of it comes with age. I think I was certainly, a little bit more on the maybe over loud, overconfident side in my, as a younger pilot, and
Mhm.
got better with time. And it's never a straight line, right? Hopefully, it looks like the stock market, though. It's always going up. We hope,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah.
not a sawtooth.
Yeah. And let me just ask you, because I think this is important for the coaches listening. Clearly, though, if you coach a team for long enough, if you're running a high performance team in the Navy for long enough, um, you're going to come across these people on your team that are high impact, right? They're super talented, but they're also really high maintenance
Yeah.
because of whether it's cockiness or brashness or whatever it is. Phil Jackson had the Dennis Rodmans, right? So how did you learn? How were you taught? And how did you work with the high impact, someone who could really make a difference for your team, but they were really high maintenance? And how did you get the rest of your team to understand that maybe, while I'm going to treat everyone fairly, it's not always equally?
Yeah, boy, that is such a good question, John. And I think I wouldn't probably give myself the highest marks on that. I've solved that, because I think that is a problem that, a lot of it's individually based. But a lot of it you could extrapolate to a personality type. And I would say that the tools that I used for that I found success with weren't so much trying to engage one on one with that person, but was trying to, or maybe you have a small group that's sort of in that camp. Uh, what I found was where I found some success in that at times was in really trying to aspire the team to a selfless standard, or a set of standards. You could call them on field and off field standards that are tough to reach and aspirational, and they would include those sort of things, right? Uh, an approach that's accountable, that's team first, that's all about attitude and hustle, that's not speaking bad about teammate or the coach or the what, there's always somebody squawking, right? This is a bunch of whatever. And those people can be really toxic and cancerous, right? And so if you can establish standards that are really about a positive team first approach, and then connect those standards to a line that says, okay, meeting these standards are selfless, and that's one of our core values that we're going for here. That's a team first approach. We're putting the team over self, and therefore abiding by the agreed upon standards that we've all sat down and agreed on. Not that we're dictated by me as the leader or the coach or whatever, but we've all bought into this. We've all agreed that this is what this campaign is going to be about, this season, this tour, or whatever it is. These are our agreed upon cultural, sort of crown jewels. Anything that you do that's not that is by definition selfish.
Mm-hmm.
And so you use that as, I found success in pointing to that as, hey, we've agreed on these standards, and we've also agreed that not meeting them is by definition selfish and not selfless, and therefore you're putting yourself over the team. And so you can kind of attack it as that, hey, these are the behaviors that we've set as our standards, and those outliers that you might see in someone who's very, selfish with the ball or cocky, maybe they're so good they're not working as hard as others, or whatever the behavior that's manifesting that's really hurting your head and hurting the team. You tie it back to those standards and that selfish line.
Yeah.
Does it always work? No, but at some point it might drive you to the point where it's like, hey, this isn't a good fit for you. And sometimes you have an option to have that person move on maybe earlier than planned, or sometimes you don't, right? Sometimes you just got to keep building the team that you've got, and that's challenging for sure. And sometimes you need help too, and I think that maybe goes to the vulnerable piece that Jerry brought up, which is it took me a while to figure out the difference between vulnerability and confidence, and actually how interrelated they are. How much confidence it takes to show some vulnerability, how much confidence it takes to ask for help, to say, hey, I want to get this right. Can you please back me up? Or boy, I'm struggling. I think a context for that's easy to understand is, you're the new flight leader of the Blue Angels. You don't know a thing. You've got more experience than anyone on the team by double, and yet you've never done anything like that. And so you're reliant on much more junior pilots who have spent a year in that environment and are true experts on the profiles, on the maneuvers, and all the pieces that go into preparing for each flight, the cultural norms and all those things. And they're all looking at you to lead them, and you don't know how to do it. And it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of vulnerability, and you get wire brushed a lot in that learning process. So if you don't start humble, you're going to be humble for sure, because it's just that much of a fish out of water learning it. But just asking for help, just saying I'm struggling with this piece is really powerful, because what is anybody's response to that? Well, I'd be happy to help. Let me help you. Thanks for asking. Oh, you want my opinion? Especially when you're asking that of younger, your more junior folks. Hey, what am I missing here? How do you help me understand, so I can make a better decision? Or what do you need that I'm not given? Asking it maybe not quite such a confrontational way, but just saying, hey, what are some ideas on how we might do this better? You'd be amazed what you find out. As opposed to assuming you've got it. But it's really hard to ask that question, especially when things aren't going well, and you can feel that too.
Yeah.
That's in the air already.
You
Jerry,
mentioned that at some point, I remember you saying vulnerability, humility, Ryan, it could burn you, it can backfire. And I think there's a lot of people out there that are afraid to take it on. I mean, if you're Steve Kerr, you find out that he can walk into a locker room and say, that's on me, guys. I didn't prepare you well enough. Be very humble about it. But there's some things about him that allow him to be that way and have the confidence, as you say so well, Ryan. If you have vulnerability, you have confidence, the confidence to be vulnerable. But there are people out there that don't have that confidence to be vulnerable, and they're afraid, where is this going to go? What if it backfires? Or how does it backfire? How can it burn you?
Right. I think if I could look back, and there have been some times where my either maybe call it my fault or maybe my pursuit of, I really want to be this way. I want to be a humble leader. I want to be, I don't want, here's a great, context. You could imagine in the Blue Angel context, a lot of it could go to your head, right? We're all just normal people, but suddenly, there's the people want your autograph, and there's lines of people, and you're driving in a police escort, and you got big crowds, and it's a bizarre experience. It's total Twilight Zone.
Well,
It's kind of,
you could relate to the Beatles back in the 60s, right?
I don't know if it was that level, but I could certainly relate to, what a lot of these,
NASCAR.
yeah,
NASCAR.
pro athletes, or it's just a bizarre experience, and it's really easy for it to go to your head. And so I felt like, I probably erred too much on the other side, and I had one of my wingmen once say, hey, like you kind of, your call sign is boss when you're the boss,
Hmm.
when you're the CEO and flight leader, and he said, boss, you're the boss of the Blue Angels. Like,
Yeah.
go, like, put your chest out a little bit.
Yeah.
And I heard him, and I
Oh,
understood what he meant,
wow.
but at the same time, I was like, if I do that, this is all for naught. I will not be true to myself, and also, that's not why we're here. It shouldn't matter. That title certainly doesn't matter. It's about the mission. It's about the outreach. It's a certainly a privilege to be here, but I need to wear that with humility, 100%, all the way through my core. And so it was really interesting because he's a great guy and teammate, but he wanted to see a little bit more out of me on that, and I don't know that I gave it to him. But where you asked the question, Jerry, was it can burn you, and yes, being vulnerable, I think, means being open. You're sharing some of the problems that are on your mind, what's hurting your head, where you think there's weakness. And I think some people will take that and they'll manipulate it. They'll turn it against you. They'll use that. They'll put that information in their pocket, and they'll go and find a time to use it as leverage, or to share that information that was shared in confidence with someone they shouldn't have.
Mm.
And I think the same thing with the humility and vulnerability. It can be mistaken as a lack of confidence,
Mm.
so people can lose some faith in that, or mistake when they see that in someone else as, oh, see, that's a stronger leader,
Right.
and sometimes that's going to burn you. And my only response to that is, and I've been burned by it, and it's not, I don't feel good about it, and sometimes when I replay some of those things, it hurts still. But I would rather make that mistake than the opposite, the error in the opposite direction. And this ties right in, John, to your question about, what about that player on your team that's the really cocky, hard to get along with, selfish player, whatever the adjective you want to use is. That some of those people are gonna burn you too, but
Mm-hmm.
they're not the people that matter in the long run. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The people that you care about, the people that you feel like your brothers and sisters, the people that become like family to you, are not those. They'll go on their way and they'll have their life, and they may be very successful in that endeavor or others. Um, and so that's all you can do, is let them go do those things, and know that they're not going to matter, to you in the long run. And I think, I've seen that even with my children's sports teams. You can already see some of those players where, they're not going to be lifelong friends because of the approach that they're taking, or that their parents are taking, or whatever. And some others, you see all the character coming out there. You see all the things that you want youth sports to bring out in your children coming out, right? And you're like,
Mm-hmm.
God, this is great. The character development is the most important thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And you see it happening. And so I think it all comes down to character. That's the answer that I was searching for. Is it's about character, and you can choose to be, you have some control over your character and the long-term outcomes of that. And I would rather just err on the side of humility, and be okay with being burned sometimes by it. Same goes for
It's
vulnerability.
it's interesting though, and I think, just to tie this together, right? We talked about being confident and humble. and how those can go together. Well, that means we also have to be competent. Steve Kerr said to us, Jerry, right? He's like, you got to know what you're talking about. So you can't be incompetent and then vulnerable at the same time, because at that point, people know you don't know what you're doing and you
Yeah,
don't have any confidence that you can
great
do
point.
it. So no one's going to
Yeah.
follow you in that point, right? But then, yeah, I mean, I can also see your teammate in that moment, maybe also saying puff your chest out, only because what he's saying is make sure your body language shows that you believe in us and you believe in what we're doing,
Yeah.
right? So you can't be so humble that you look like, oh god, I don't know that we're going to get this done today. Like
Yeah.
sometimes as the leader, you got to like instill that belief, even though it's 10 of us against 100 of them. We can do this, and that's maybe where that chest puffing is a necessary thing. I don't know. That was just
That's,
a thought as you were
that's an
saying that.
incredible point, John. And maybe that's what he was looking for
That's
from
what I'm thinking he's
before.
looking
Yeah.
Yeah,
for.
that's a great point.
I didn't get that, but I do think the confidence needs to be there for any of this to work. And if it's not there, it's not going to be your only problem, right? It won't be a lack of humility or a false bravado or whatever. And there's only one way to do that, right? The only way the confidence comes is through the work, the
Yeah.
reps, right? And so yeah, you can be thrust into a situation where you're just way out over your skis, and it's going to be really hard to have that confidence. You really have no business being there, perhaps.
Mhm.
And so now you've got to fight through that. But I think credibility factors into this as well, right? If you're coming in with a lot of credibility, which was me in the Blue
And the Blue
Angels,
Angels, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I had a lot of credibility, but zero competence. I was certainly confident about the next step I was going to do, but I had a big mountain to climb.
Mhm.
I think the credibility will carry you a long ways, and with that, now humility and vulnerability go very nicely as a complementary way.
And we've had many high level athletes on this podcast or um, in conversation say, that coach they have who had great credibility because of their playing resume, right?
Right.
They also have a small window to either win or lose the locker room, right?
Sure.
So all that credibility can go out the window if your people don't think that you're in it for them. If you're in
Yeah.
it for yourself, if this is, if I'm doing this just so that I can get the next thing up and become a general, become an admiral, get the next head coaching job, whatever it is, and you guys are just a stepping stone that's very transactional, your credibility's gone. But if your credibility is, hey, I am in it for all of you and I'm going to make you all better, and together we're, all boats rise, right? And then that lack of experience, of domain experience coupled with your credibility is okay.
I completely agree, and you just put me right back into a situation. I think some of what you're saying is that there's a time and a place for all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of it's a small window, and some of it's about where you express your vulnerability or let your frustration out. Or I'll give you an example. This is what popped into my head. One of the really important lessons I learned in this same time frame that we're talking about, where I came in with credibility, but I had to figure all this stuff out, and it was a lot of pressure, and I didn't have a lot of time to do it. We would do most of our training. We do about 140 flights out in the desert in Southern California in El Centro, east of San Diego, each winter, because it's sunny pretty much every day out there that time of year. And so it's kind of our home away from home, and we're flying 3 flights a day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 flights a day, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, do some laundry and some studying on Sunday. And you do that for 3 months, and it's grueling, but it's really cool. So we're out there, and the range that we would fly in was called Shady Tree, and we'd be out there, and you could kind of set it up like an air show. And we were just doing the blocking and tackling, the footwork, right? Just trying to figure out how to do this formation roll. That's kind of the building block of all the other maneuvers. So 4 airplanes in a diamond formation doing this big sort of corkscrewing roll. And it looks great when we do it right. It's super hard to get the hang of, and it's very unnatural at the altitudes we're doing it at initially, and all those things. And so it takes a while. It takes hundreds of rolls till you start to really get it right. Um, not including the hundreds and hundreds more you do in your head between flights, right?
Hmm.
And so we're out there, and I'm just struggling, and it's sort of one of those diminishing returns days, right? Where we've done 4 or 5 of them, and they're not getting better, and we probably should move on. But the trainee knows, in the airplane behind me is asking for another one, and we come through the next one, and I punt that one also, right? It doesn't finish right at all, and I messed the radio call up at the end too because I was frustrated. And so I've got, a wingman on either side. Number two's on my right side. Number three's on my left side. Number four's underneath me. And we're not super close at this point, like air show close, but we're, 3 or 4 feet of separation between the airplanes. And
3 or 4 feet.
oh yeah, right. So maybe 5 feet at this point.
Not that
Jesus,
not that
not
close.
that close.
We get down to like inches later on. But anyways, this one doesn't go that well. And so number that's off my wingtip, right? Number two is sitting maybe 4 feet off my right wingtip for this role. And he's been there for a year before. And it's really his job to be my coach. He knows the profiles, and his job is to get me right on the profiles. But he's also sitting behind me. If you can picture, the wings on an F-18 are about 30 feet behind the cockpit. And so he's sitting off my wingtip looking up at about a 45-degree angle at the back of my helmet. So he can't see my face, but he can just see my helmet. And it was unbelievable. This guy, his name's Matt Siderhout. He could sometimes tell me where my eyeballs were looking. Hey, boss, you're looking at the wrong building right now, the wrong tree. How does he know where my eyeballs are right now? But he could tell from the way my airplane was flying. So I came out of this role, and I gave a very imperceptible sort of, like expletive with a head sort of, nod.
Yeah.
I thought no one could see it, but I said something that only it wasn't on the radio, but I could hear it in the cockpit, and I didn't think anyone even noticed it, right? And we got back and we debriefed the flight, and he lots of learning and whatever, and then he pulled me aside, just me and him. And he said, "Hey, boss, can I talk to you?" And, "Yeah, Maddie, what's up?" And he goes, "Hey, we came out of that 5th roll, 6th roll, whatever it was, and you got pissed." And I kind of paused, and I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "You can't do that." And I was like, you're kind of like, "Oh, come on." Like, how do you not? And he goes, "It's real simple." He goes, "I know how you feel. We know the roll sucked. We were all right there with you. We were a few feet away. We all flew it with you. And we know you're working really hard on it. But what we need in that moment is you leading us. What we need in that moment is you looking out in front of the airplane and setting up for the next piece of the flight, which is coming at 300 or 400 miles an hour anyways, right? There's no time to be wallowing in this mistake that is receding in our wake at whatever our ground speed is, in this case about 400 miles an hour. There's no time for that. What we're counting on you doing is leading us and moving forward, recognize the mistake, move forward, and we'll talk about it at the right time and place, which is back here afterwards. And I think that ties to, there's a point to be quiet and to be vulnerable and to be humble. And there's other times where you need to be focused and purposeful and not letting other things get in the way, because that's undercutting all of it.
Because the only play that matters is the next one.
Exactly.
Not the last one. Yeah.
And it's coming at you fast.
Yeah, and it's coming at you really fast. We're getting at the end of our time here, and I know Jerry and I wanted to talk about, which you just mentioned, which clicked it into my head, the importance of this debrief. That after the good days, after the bad days, it doesn't matter. Part of our habits is that we always debrief, because I think a lot of coaches tend to debrief a lot when things go poorly and don't debrief when things go well. And there's plenty to learn then too. So talk about how this is something that in the military, you always debrief no matter what.
Yeah, boy, it's a whole other conversation, and it's one I'm super passionate about. But if I were to just hit a few of the wave tops, it's definitely embedded in naval aviation. I think all of aviation, but it's certainly a cultural imperative for us that's where the learning's going to come, because we don't have time to pause or call a timeout while we're flying. We keep moving and we come back and talk about it. But because I think of those constraints, there's great power that I've found and that we've harnessed in different contexts of debriefs in naval aviation. I think what's interesting about it is the juxtaposition in my mind between talking about the mistake and learning from it and doing so, and then actually that accountability piece actually making you feel so much better. So that, the kind of the tension between, well, I don't want to have this mistake brought up. I don't want to get my hand in the air and say, hey, I really messed that up. And yet when you do that, how much of a cathartic experience it is, but even more importantly, it allows you to learn and it allows the rest of your team to learn. So instead of maybe quietly learning from, hey, I keep missing that shot, but I'll keep working on it or whatever it is, we're going to talk about it. It's going to be brief. We're going to say, hey, this is what was wrong. And we're going to then move on. It's not going to be personal or anything like that. It's just, hey, this was the mistake that was made. Here's how we're going to fix it. If you ritualize that, if you make that part of your culture, it now creates an environment where mistakes are going to be embraced. It's going to be an environment where learning is going to be enhanced, and the entire team is going to elevate by the accountability, the vulnerability of saying, hey, I made a mistake. Let's talk about it briefly. And then especially if you also tie that together with commitment to the team, right? So as you finish talking about what your mistake is, you also make a declarative statement about fixing it or about wanting to be a part of this team, about getting it tomorrow, getting it next time. Hey, I made this mistake. I'm going to miss the opportunity to pass across, to so-and-so. I'm going to fix that tomorrow. And I can't wait to get after it. The way we would say it in the Blues is we'd finish our, here's what I messed up, very succinctly, and then just say, I'll fix it all. And I'm glad to be here, which doesn't mean I'm going to fix it necessarily tomorrow, but I'm sure going to try. And then once I fix that, I'm going to be fixing the next mistake after that, but I'm going to keep working. And boy, it's good to be here with you all, to be in this part of this team. And I think that's really powerful.
What an opportunity to build trust.
Yes.
And as we know, trust is the undergirding structural pieces that build culture and team. So we come full circle now back to the beginning. Right. And so through your statements, Ryan, I could feel like, you know what, I'm gonna go along with this. I trust you. I believe in you. I'm here for you. All because we were open, receptive, vulnerable, and willing to make a difference in our culture by taking accountability.
It's so powerful.
Yep. OMG, right? I mean, what the heck? Well, John, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That first step though, right? To get to the cycle to complete, to build that trust circle around, right, you got to start with that vulnerability, which comes with some psychological safety, right? When I first heard that concept, I'm like, well, all you're talking about is trust. Well, it's a little bit more complex than that, right? You have to, there's these components, right? You have to be willing to take that step and say, I made that mistake, but that also has to be embraced, encouraged.
Well, you're talking about the environment of safety, and so many environments out there. People that are listening to us know that they exist. There are so many environments out there where it doesn't feel safe to talk like that. But our job as leaders, as coaches, as mentors and guides, parents, needs to be, we create this environment. It's safe. It doesn't mean you're not going to get called out. You'll get called out, but it's not personal. It's about correction. It's about expansion. It's a growth mindset, isn't it?
Absolutely. And when I hear someone do that, my trust for them goes up.
Absolutely.
They said, I made that mistake. Yeah. I'm going to fix it. You go, okay, cool. I'm going to stop worrying about that. And then when we say the same thing and we go all the way around the circle and everybody talked about their mistakes, we all go, okay, I'm not alone in this. Right? So the cycle just starts to gain strength of the safety and trust working together with the accountability and the vulnerability. And I think it's so incredibly powerful.
Yeah. And I think because you have these guidelines around it, that at the end you tie it back to my accountability to the team, it is so huge. And I think about this because my wife's a surgeon, and when you're a surgeon, of course, if you've done it long enough, you're going to have some bad outcomes. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to do whatever. And so, most hospitals have these things where sometimes where something goes badly, you have to present it to the surgery committee or whatever. And so over many years of being a surgeon now, she's, had to present this a couple of times. But the problem is that there's no guidelines around, but by doing the work, by presenting the case, by getting people poke holes in your decision-making process, you could become better. But what I've seen it become for her a couple of times is just an opportunity for people to take pot shots at her with no help, no whatever. So this incredible opportunity to learn and get better just becomes something that you dread and you don't want to talk about, and then you become insular, and then no one talks about their mistakes. And so it's the same process without the guidelines and without, finishing with, and we're doing this because of us, and we are all making mistakes, is absolutely key for any coach who's thinking of doing this. Don't just make this be how you can humiliate someone on your team for making a mistake, because that's not going to work.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think if you can make this cultural, if you can build this process into your daily, weekly, wherever it fits, and there's no one right answer, but if you can build it in, um, it becomes a culture that is a learning culture, and it becomes one that is continuously growing. As Jerry said, it becomes one where you are on a path to high performance, and if you're achieving high performance, you're not gonna stagnate. You're gonna continue to learn and grow. And I think it is the singular piece. If I could point to all of my naval aviation experience, that was what was propelling me forward, and not just me, but the squadron I was in, my teammates, my wingmen. Um, it's I think it's the kind of the lifeblood of that learning organization. It's also a topic we could talk about for a long time.
Yeah,
Well,
next time.
the other topic we can talk about. So I want to whet the appetite of others because John, we have to have Ryan back here.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't stop right now, but I'm going to jot down notes. So we'll kick off the next session with this statement. You're talking about Top Gun instructor. You're dealing with weapon systems like the F-18, super. What is it? The
Super Hornet, yeah.
Super
Mhm.
Hornet, right? Uh, it doesn't get any more sophisticated electronically than that. I know this. But you make a statement, and we will go on and keep this for the future. The iPhone is a weapon system. In a
Absolutely.
day of social media where everyone adores and idolizes that weapon system, we need to know what that means in order for us to move forward and understand the culture that's growing up today. You agree?
I couldn't agree more. I think
Okay,
it's a
so
lesson that we're putting in the hands of our kids.
okay,
Mhm.
right? And and
Mhm.
and so John, I'm going to make note of that the next
We'll,
time.
we'll
And
make note of it, but I think finish the sentence. It's a weapon system to defeat culture, unity, belonging, commitment. That's what it's
exactly, I
going to
didn't want
be
to go
about.
there because then it's like let's keep talking. I
No,
want to find
no,
now. I want to find out. But you're
Not
no.
right.
just for kids either, which we can unpack too. This adults are not immune, and we're not somehow wiser than
Oh, no
it
doubt.
taps into our basic human functions, and I believe it.
I'm not even halfway there in my growth process. So
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. I'd
Yeah.
be honored to come back on.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, this was an amazing conversation. So much insight from someone who has been a leader of some of the most high performing teams in the world. Just wonderful. And yes, we will definitely have you back on, because maybe we'll bring you and Cindy on together, and we'll have a
Oh, that'd
real
be so fun.
conversation about all this stuff. So thank you so much for being on the Way of Champions. This was just fantastic. And is there, if people wanted to reach out to you, is there a way that they would get a hold of you these days, or are you incognito?
I'm fairly incognito these days, though I'm looking to sort of gradually ease back into a little bit more accessibility. I can certainly be emailed if one of your listeners wants to discuss any of this. My email is just first name dot last name at Gmail, so that's easy enough. If
Perfect.
someone wants to discuss this further, or I do some consulting in this space, and so if somebody wants to look at that, I'm open to that as well. But yeah, mostly
Awesome.
I'm hanging back a little bit deliberately right now, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good thing. That's a good thing. Awesome. Well, hey, Ryan, thank you so much for being on the Way of Champions.
What an honor, Chance. I really, really appreciate it. And I love what this podcast is about. So it's very cool to be a part of it.
thank
Thank
you,
you.
Ryan. Appreciate